afternoon. And
so when you compare sort of East versus West, you get exposed to an awful lot of different, I guess you could say, religious as well as philosophical traditions. And just because I spent nearly 4 years in Nepal and actually have a Nepali family and still go back regularly, Hinduism is the one that I know the most about, and Buddhism. And actually Nepal is the cradle of Buddhism. And of course, Hinduism came to Nepal a little more recently. Hinduism is really from Central India is where it started and then spread from there. So I've had a lot of background, and it just always kind of interested me because I grew up Catholic, but I started really questioning just these ideas of deities in general and supernatural things when I was a child, much to the chagrin of my mother. And by the time I was late teenage years, I was really an atheist. And we never talked about it. Like, she never brought it up. All she ever told me was, as long as you live in my house, you have to go to the Catholic Church every week. And so I did. And then after age 18, I moved out of her house. And whenever I'd come back and visit, she never brought it up again. So she kind of, I guess, got used to the fact that that religion just didn't quite take with me. But I was also very fascinated just over the years in general and in travels, but also just reading world news. I'm one of these people, I barely look at the Miami Herald. I listen to the BBC, and I subscribe to The Economist. So, I'm kind of always thinking internationally. And just how many problems of the world and throughout all of history, as well as obviously now, relate to religion. And you can't really say that religion is the cause of these things necessarily, but it's certainly a factor in ways that humans segregate themselves into the us's and the them's. I mean, you look at the Old Testament, and it's all over the place. God punishes the Egyptians for enslaving the Jews, and then he commands the Jews to capture your slaves from among the heathens of neighboring lands, and this and that. So, commandment, what is number 5? Thou shalt not kill. But then he orders, that obviously means the Hebrews shall not kill Hebrews. But then he orders the same Hebrews to kill everybody else around them, including in Deuteronomy. Kill your mother, kill your father, kill your wife, kill your kid if they practice a different religion. So obviously when you look at that, some religions, and I would argue that the worst forms that we've seen throughout the years are the more fundamentalist forms of Christianity as well as Islam. I think most people would agree, except for Muslims and fundamentalist Christians, of course, that those are probably the worst. But then when you think about it, they're actually doing what the God of Abraham in their respective texts commands them to do. So they're the ones following the religion the best. I mean, certainly Anglicans aren't. They have all these weird views, like they even accept homosexuals. I mean, that's not in accordance with the book. And, you could go on with many, many examples of this. And a lot of Christians, just kind of general Christians that I've talked to, get around this by telling me, well, ours is the New Covenant. We have the New Testament. It's not the Old Testament. And then you start asking them, well, where did all these prophecies that supposedly lead to Jesus come from, the Old Testament? Of course, Jews don't believe their prophecies at all. They don't accept Jesus, so there's an issue there. Where do the 10 Commandments come from, the Old Testament? Are you going to throw all those out? No, of course not. So they believe the Old Testament too. They just hypocritically acknowledge that they don't. And of course, in Matthew in the New Testament, Jesus flat out says, I'm not changing a tittle of the law. Everything stands, and of course, he never corrects any of it. He never says, you shouldn't keep people as slaves, for example. So people that have argued, and some have to me, in fact, one lady, this was ironic, it was at one of our song swaps on a Sunday. We're at the Dice House in East Kendall, where some of you might have been. It's in a county park out there. What is it? Continental Park or something. There were a whole bunch of us there. And I sang one of my songs, which is called The Sons of Abraham. And it really, one of the lines is, let's see, I don't have the quote right here, but my soul is not saved. I don't believe your ancient vile hypocrisies. I just sang it right out in front of this whole crowd. And this woman came up to me later, no hostility whatsoever. And she says, well, if you don't believe that, where does your morality come from? And I looked at her because I knew that she and her husband were Jewish. And I said, are you kidding me? if you were to follow the morality in your books of Moses, you'd be on death row in the state of Florida. Obviously, nobody's morality comes from that nonsense that says kill all the Amalekites, kill all the Canaanites, kill everybody who's of a different religion, slice the pregnant women's bellies open, smash the fetuses. They don't use that word, but the babies on rocks, etc., etc. So it's just dumbfounding to me that people could even think that. I could see, to some extent, if you were a Buddhist, to think that morality comes from religion, because there's a lot of good messages, but there's no real canon in Buddhism. The literature just grows on and on over the centuries, and there's no real single canon to follow, which is why Theravedic Buddhists are so different from monastic Buddhists from the Himalayas, and are so different from Zen Buddhists from Japan, for example. But at least you could see where morality comes from a lot of those texts, even though it's not there. You can't really call them canonical religious texts. It's really more like philosophical treatises, basically. And for the same reason, I could see where people who are Jains could think that morality comes from their religion. As far as anybody else, I can't figure it out at all, and especially with the monotheistic religions that all, emanate from the God of Abraham. So then the question is, I'm getting really dry here. I'm sitting in my office. Where does morality come from? And partly what I talked about a little bit when I was asked by Glima and Chris Kirshner to speak at the UU Church is my thoughts on secular morality. But my background is in conservation biology and animal behavior, and so I talked about it from the standpoint of animal behavior. And it is known, and there have been tomes written for many years now about the biology, the evolution of moral systems, and especially in social mammals, and especially when you get to social mammals with larger cephalic ratios, that is brain mass to body weight ratios. So from that, I gave a whole bunch of examples about what, tenet of morality, for example, is equity or fairness. And we see it to some degree in dogs. I think the example I gave was, if you give one dog a treat and you have two dogs, that won't work. They know, to the extent of one got one, the other one didn't, that there's a problem there. And then the one that didn't get a treat will voice its concern. But that's about it. That's a very crude measure of fairness with canines like that. And we also know adult dogs will not share at all. You got the big dog will get them all if it can. So then we go from situations like that, and we look at other situations. For example, wild canids share all the time, but it's only the adults that share with the pups. They don't share with each other. So there are different standards of it, all the way up to things like chimps and elephants and dolphins that have been shown to not only share food, but reciprocally hunt, and also learn how to do so with other organisms. So there's classic examples of traditional fishermen, for example, who have learned to hunt with dolphin pods near shore, where the dolphins will kind of swish the fish towards them. They'll catch a lot of fish in their nets, and then they throw half of it back to the dolphins. So both species benefit. So really with social mammals, we go all the way from, a crude understanding, I guess you will, of what is fairness, which is one of the tenets of morality, by the way, one of the moral tenets, all the way up to a very high understanding of what is fairness in animals. So then the question is, why do we need a God for it? Obviously, dolphins are not reading the Old Testament. And I think I gave quite a few other examples, too, of animals in social contexts. And so when you look at fairness, equity, ability to show empathy or sympathy or things like this, we have tons and tons of examples. And again, the ones that come closest to us are just the things with the biggest brains. So elephants, for example, that have enormous brains, even show what we would look at to perceive as grieving. And sadly, it happens all the time because of the ivory trade. But grieving over dead herd mates, for example. And you can't really attribute human emotions to them. We don't know what they're thinking inside, but we do know that The endocrine glands of vertebrates are amazingly similar throughout. I mean, from fish all the way on up. And we do know that the brain states, of some of the brain states at least, that change within us when we feel certain emotions, like fear or sadness or things like this, that specifically traits to particular chemicals that are emitted from glands that alter brain activity. So we know all of these things, and we're learning more and more about it. Animal cognition is now a huge field in animal behavior. I have not kept up with any of that because I've worked, since I did my PhD, almost exclusively in conservation, because I'm much more concerned about that with the decline of so many species. But I do occasionally read new books and new articles about it, and it's just amazing what we're finding out and how similar so many brains are, and also how different. For example, typical toothed whales, which includes dolphins and orcas and things like that, porpoises, their cephalic ratios are actually quite a bit bigger than ours. But the biggest lobes they have to do with hearing, because they have enormous abilities to echolocate and to travel throughout their entire environment. And we now know that they don't even need to see to do it. If they're in dark water or whatever, they could completely get around the whole environment without any optical stimulus at all. So, so we're not, I guess you could say, completely the same, but we certainly have a lot of characteristics. And it's also very, very interesting to think that as we get closer and closer to humans, that's where you get closer and closer to what we perceive, at least in our behaviors, to constitute morality. Chimps, for example, laugh and cry. Nobody ever knew that until probably about 50 or 60 years ago. Chimps also have huge numbers of facial expressions that are really similar to primitive human ones. For example, grimacing if you're mad or fighting is another common thing that chimps do. So they don't have language, but they're able to do all kinds of things and express all kinds of emotions that would speak to this issue of morality, showing sympathy, showing showing fairness, able to engage in equity. It's even been shown that if there's a hungry chimp and a full chimp, the hungry chimp could convince the full chimp to help him find food. They don't do it with alacrity, but they will help, at least for a while. And so that shows a higher order level of compassion in that sense. And then, not surprisingly, because biology is now really gelled up very well now in terms of across all fields, but the genome of humans and chimps is closer to each other than anything else. Chimps are more like us than gorillas are like the chimps. And the genomes of humans, gorillas, and chimps are more like each other than they are to orangutans, which makes sense because orangutans are far removed in Southeast Asia, and the other species are all African, or at least in our origin were African. And so we're finding out more and more now across the biological sciences that the gross anatomy, the gross morphology, the fine anatomy, the biochemistry, the physiology, the brain anatomy, and the endocrine systems, and the behavioral outcomes of all those things all relate to the genetics of those things. And we have more and more genomes mapped now, and that's only been the last 20 years we've been able to do that. And we're finding out that, yeah, we are closer to chimps than they are to gorillas. Nobody would have thought that before we actually were able to look at genes and behaviors to the extent that we can do now, and also map brain states to the extent that we can do now, which is all very, very new and exciting. So from that, I gather there doesn't need to be a God to be morality, but I had already gathered that before I knew any of this other stuff. Because after all, like I said, if you followed the moral standards in the Old Testament, you'd be on death row in the state of Florida. You'd have to go to a nicer northern state, and then you'd only be in prison for life without parole, because they're abhorrent. They're absolutely abhorrent. Nobody follows those standards anymore, unless you're Al-Qaeda or ISIS or these kinds of groups that are not popular, let me say that, when you look at the sum total of humanity out there. So then the question is can we, given that we do have the largest cerebric ratio, that is, our cerebrum is far and away the biggest of all brains that we know of, given our body size, and that's where higher thinking occurs. And probably many of you have heard that little lobe that forms in the front of the cerebrum isn't even fully formed in humans until we're in our early 20s, which actually explains a lot of teenage behavior, because that's the lobe that controls a lot of impulsive behaviors and things like that. So it takes an awful long time for a human to grow up. You know, compared to a chimp, like when they're a month old, they're grabbing onto their mother and hanging on. A human baby, when it's 6 months old, you're happy if it manages to roll over once, you know. So obviously it takes us a lot longer to grow up, partly because the brain has to grow through so many stages to get as big as it is, and partly because that's important. That's been the most important thing for our survival. But these are all not differences of kind, they're differences of extent. So we are related to all these other things and all these other species, and our behaviors correlate with that. So now let's get into what I think of for morality. First of all, I think of morality as being well-being, how we treat each other in society. I think if any of you saw that movie, like when Tom Hanks was cast away on an island. Anybody saw that movie years ago, and it was growing hairier and hairier and grosser. I mean, if that's the case, there's nobody to be moral or immoral to, okay, if you're just alone. And we also find the moral metrics mapping in across animal behavior too, with species that are more and more social. So, you know, we have rudimentary behaviors that we would call moral in terms of parenting behaviors and some things like this, with animals that are relatively solitary. And then we go all the way up to things that live always in highly integrated groups, like a lot of primates or a lot of cetaceans or things like that. So we have that thing in the natural world as well. When we start talking about modern society, what the basis of morals is, and I guess we could also say how morals change. What it also means is that there is no absolute standard out there, which is what a lot of religious people want to argue. But we can, I think, dispossess ourselves with that idea almost immediately, because if that were the case, for example, I mean, if there were one religious belief in one God and one set of standards in all humans worldwide, maybe you could make that argument more succinctly. But given that there are so many different religions and so many different human values and so many different kinds, for example, just a very simple commandment, thou shalt not kill. Well, obviously, I already said that in the Old Testament, that only applies to God telling Hebrews not to kill other Hebrews, right? Because he's telling them to kill everybody else anyway. And but even in modern society, we have this understanding that, okay, there are categories in which it's perfectly okay to kill another fellow human being. Self-defense, for example, defense of others, times of warfare, et cetera, et cetera. But now we're moving into this situation, and these represent moral dilemmas, I think, in modern society. I think we need to have these arguments wide open. If we define morality in terms of harm, we could, the basic thing would be, well, killing somebody is harmful to them, so therefore it's immoral. Stop right there. But now we have this ability with modern medicine to keep, how do I put this politely, because we've all gone through this, myself included, but if somebody's going through this now, I don't want to really hurt their feelings, but to see, old relatives basically who are dead, but they're still alive because of modern medicine. And they get weaker and weaker and weaker. And, I mean, if I could have, and I've said this often in my classes too, if I could have, I would have euthanized my mother when she was about 81 or 82. She lived till she was 85. In the last 3 years, she was completely bedridden, and there was nothing physically wrong with her. She was so depressed that she just wanted to die. She didn't want to see anybody, and she wanted to die, and she was in a nursing home. So then the question is, thou shalt not kill. Killing somebody's bad. We always agree that. But under what context, besides self-defense of these things, would it be moral? And I would argue that under that context, we could make a moral argument for ending that suffering. She spent the last 3 years of her life in complete misery, wanting to die. And you could also make a more general moral argument, I think, ending that suffering, because and this figure I just pulled out recently, I don't know if these things are right, but what I read was we spend 40% of all money that's spent by Medicare in this country keeping people alive in the last few weeks or a few months or a couple years of their lives. And so you could make another moral argument from a very broad standpoint, not just ending that person's suffering by euthanasia, but also saving money, because we also have something like 15% of all kids in this country lack health insurance. So, we're putting all this money, a huge amount of money, into basically what I refer to as keeping dead people alive. And I've already told all my heirs, I don't have any kids. I was married for a while, but we didn't have kids. I have tons of nieces and nephews. I've already chosen which ones are going to be handling my stuff. And I just said, kill me, whatever, Everybody knows I like to drink, so give me a bunch of beer and put a bunch of sedatives in it. Nobody will ever think, nobody will know you killed me. But I don't want to spend the last 3 years of my life shitting my pants in bed in a nursing home. And I don't think anybody does, and yet that's what we're doing. So, but this is a moral dilemma for a lot of people, because a lot of people would say, oh, they just want to kill off grandma and inherit the money or something like this. By the way, I donated all the money I inherited from my mother, and I had a lot more money of my own when I got it. So it wasn't like I was, wanting to inherit money or anything like that. Some people might. And so what we have to do then is come up with what that standard is. And I think a few states like Washington and Oregon, and a few countries, I think, if I'm not mistaken, Belgium and Denmark have come up with those criteria for when to euthanize people who are terminally ill, and that includes very old people. So that's just one example of how secular morality would fit into this thing. The standard is, yeah, thou shalt not kill is a good idea. I don't want somebody just coming off the street and killing me, and therefore I should not have the right to do the same thing to somebody else. But there are going to be exceptions to it. And I also think that if you use that standard of well-being across society and not doing harm, if we accepted that as a standard, there's a lot of more objective criteria that we could come to. But in all cases, we're going to get to these sort of moral dilemmas at some point when we carry it out further. And that's going to be where it varies. I don't really think that's different in terms of any society now that I can think of, any modern society. I do think that countries under Sharia law are practicing a religious form, but I don't think the United States is or really ever has. When we look at one controversy, for example, like the abortion controversy, I don't see anywhere in any of the biblical texts where God or anybody else considers fetuses to be human. There are multiple places in the text where God orders people to kill fetuses. I already mentioned one. It's usually like killing somebody else that's not of your religion, things like that. There's also a place I think it's in Numbers, where God orders a census, but it's only a census of males because he's interested in who can become holy men in the future, and women weren't allowed. And what he specifically orders is, don't count anybody until they're at least a month old. So according to that text, God doesn't count newborns as humans, which we do. How on earth could he count first trimester fetuses as humans? So I don't even understand the anti-abortion crowd, where they think that comes from religion. I do understand it if you're a Buddhist, because they believe that the soul transfer is very early in conception. So if you're a Buddhist, I do understand it, but these people are supposedly Christians, and they're supposedly, according to them, the only pure Christians, and yet there's nothing in this book that says anything like that. There's also no tradition in any legal system in the West, or anywhere on earth, for example, that I know of, that recognizes citizenship of fetuses, or even worse than that, fertilized eggs. So I don't know where that argument comes from a religious standpoint or from a legal standpoint. And therefore, I'm pro-choice. What's the issue there? It seems to me that we all have the right to bodily autonomy. It is true, for example, I'm losing my voice. I'll try to suck on a halt. It's true, for example, that if, let me pick on Glima because she's right there. If she needed a pint of blood on an emergency basis, and there was only the 8 of us there. And it was determined, for example, that Cliff's blood was the only blood that matched hers, so he was the only potential donor in that group of 8. There is no law that would force Cliff to give that pint of blood. In other words, his right to bodily autonomy in our law supersedes her right to live, even though it's only a pint of blood. Now, I would assume, I don't know Cliff, I know Gleam a little better, I don't know Cliff, but he looks like a nice guy. So I assume if that were the case and there were only the 8 of us and he was the only donor and it was only a pint of blood, he'd probably say, yeah, I'll give her the pint of blood and then she can live. So, but that's with consent. And to me, given that there's no precedent in law or religion that I could find, at least not in Christianity, Judaism, or Islam, that, fetuses have, rights to, or individual rights. To me, it's the same thing. A mother has to consent to have her body be used by another individual for 9 whole months and go through all those problems. And of course, there's the problems of rape, there's the problems of incest, there's the problems of sheer poverty, which is the main reason that women in this country get abortions, at least from the people I know in the sociology department who studied this, most of them are. Or then there's the other issue, which comes up usually late in pregnancy, if they find out that the baby has some serious deformity or genetically transmitted disease. But those are people that want the baby, wanted the pregnancy, but decided it was best not to have it for severe medical reasons or something like that. So to me, yeah, it is based on those standards. It is perfectly moral and it should be perfectly legal to be able to terminate a pregnancy as long as it's a non-viable early pregnancy, and based on those standards. And I think that, now that's an extreme one because that's one that within society now we argue about all the time. But I think there's a whole bunch of others that are pretty much no-brainers. And they might map to a lot of what other people think of as religious moral systems, but they might or might not. For example, there's nowhere in any of the religious texts, and in fact, it's the opposite in the Muslim texts, that we should be kind to animals. But we have agreed as a society that if you mistreat your dog or your horse or whatever, that is bad. We have laws against it. You're not going to spend life in jail if you abuse an animal, but you could get heavily fined, and you can, in some cases, spend some jail time, because we have agreed as a society that being cruel to some other creature like that does harm to us in society. I do not like to see people mistreat their dogs. I would not do that, and so I think it's good that we have agreed as a society that should be outlawed. We also agree as a society, speaking of dogs, again, there's nothing in scripture, but vicious dogs should be put down. You don't want them around. You don't want them out in the neighborhood. We have leash laws and everything else to control potentially vicious dogs, and they sometimes damage other people and other animals. We agree that things like that should be put down. So there's just tons of places where really I think so much of the laws we have and the morality we adhere to are already secular. And that's why when you talk to the especially some of the fundamentalist Christians here, but it's also true for a lot of my friends who live in Asian countries, Muslims, and also in those countries you have a lot fewer educated people, so it's very, very difficult. I don't know if any of you have heard this, but even compared to Pakistan, relatively liberal Bangladesh has been having a series of murders of secular humanists and atheists. And Bangladesh has never been under Sharia law. Bangladesh fought a law of secession from Pakistan specifically because Southeast Asia's Islam has always been a little more liberal, I guess you'd say, from Arab, and the Arab form spread all the way as far east as Pakistan. And yet it's starting to take over in Bangladesh as well. And so it's really kind of sad seeing that sort of thing. But now I feel like I'm rambling. So I gave a bunch of definitions, and I talked about some aspects of where it came from, where my own religious training, I guess you could say, started long ago, and also education. So I think we should just open it up and let people talk, and then I won't have to talk as much. And this Halls is helping, but I'm not used to talking anymore. So,
Joel, I'm just going to step in because for fear of false advertising, I did tell people that you were going to maybe mention the part about the raging bulls. Not the raging bulls,
Oh.
the herd of buffalo.
Charging buffalo.
Charging buffalo.
Well, you know, for a year and a half, I lived in Cozy Top Wildlife Reserve, and that's on the southeast Nepal and bordering India. And it, at the time, was the last herd of wild buffalo left in Nepal. There's lots of buffaloes in Nepal because the domestic variety started domestication, I think, about 4,000 or 5,000 years ago, we think. But anyway, there's very few herds of purely wild buffalo. And so it's a highly endangered species. I'm glad to say that as a result of my work and some others, they did start a new herd. They moved a bunch of buffalo into a big park further west that has much more habitat and where they used to occur. So now there's two herds, two populations of wild buffalo, and they're going to extend that because of the conservation in this area, the buffalo herd to grow and grow and grow. So when they set up this reserve back in the 1970s, I think there was 63 pure wild buffalo left. By the time I worked there in the 80s, we're up to getting to into the 90s and up to 100. And then I recensused them a few other times since then. And by the time I stopped censusing them, they got up to about 200 animals. Now they're like over 400. They're all over the place. But anyway, I was describing the social structure of buffalo because, you know, when you look at those large bovids like that, they really don't express the sum total of emotions of like some of the other animals I mentioned, like elephants or wolves or especially primates or dolphins. But they do have a very strong social structure, and they do respond to each other in very particular ways. And the herd structure is such that the females stay in the same herd that they're born. And there's always a herd bull, at least one, associated with any female herd. And for the time he's the bull, he'll get most of the matings. But then there's all these other bulls around trying to vie for dominance and things like that. But anyway, the herd structure is matrilineal. And generally the teenage bulls are kicked out by who's ever the herd bull. He's generally not their father because it turns over quickly. So you have other little herds. But the herds, the female herds in particular, are so amazingly coordinated to protect those calves. And you just see how strong it is. So if you confront them, they'll form a whole line, just one buffalo deep, an entire line, and the females are there. And in between every 2 to 3 females, there's a younger calf. And the younger calf is close to its mother, but close to another adult animal as well. And that shows, really it shows the kind of reciprocity you get with kin selection because all those females are related to each other. Elephant herds are very, very similar. And they're matrilineal, and they do that. And the whole goal of the females, if anything comes that seems to be a danger, is protect those calves. So I knew this. I'd seen them. They form that phalanx behavior a number of times when I'd be out in the field. And also, I had elephants I could use. So I would occasionally go out in an elephant, and then there's no problem, with getting charged. But more than not, I preferred not to go on the elephant. This is probably an experience none of you have had, but if you spend all day on an elephant, you're pretty sore by the end of it. And so yeah, I was young at the time. I was in my 20s, so I had no problem walking 10 miles through the reserve in the heat and stuff like that, following the animal trails and things like that. So I walked through a couple miles from the reserve headquarters, and I walked out onto this big open beach along the main channel of the Kosi River. And I thought, where's the North Herd? And then all of a sudden, because the bank dips down, it was in the dry season, so the river was kind of low. The bank dips down, and all of a sudden, I see the matriarch coming up, and she looked at me, and I thought, oh, crap. Like, I immediately thought it because I realized what was going to happen, because they were out there exposed on the beach, and I was coming from their safe zone, from the tall grasses, which is where they would prefer to hide. And then she just made this sound, and then the next thing I knew, and I was expecting it to, all of them came up onto that little ridge above the river, formed this huge phalanx, and then I didn't even hear the call, but she did something and started charging. And so the entire herd, I think about that time it was like 25 or 30 adults in that herd, plus the calves stuck in between, started running toward me. And so I realized you don't run away, because they're not trying to get me, but this is where, you know, pays to study animals. They're not trying to get me. All they're trying to do is protect the calves. And so they're coming at me in this huge line. I was in the middle of it, and I just sort of ran as fast as I could north. As they came. I could hear them behind me. I could hear the vibration moved, and they didn't attack me at all. Even the last female in the herd that passed probably within about 20 feet of me, behind me, I was still running. All they were trying to do was get to the point where they were in the tall grasses. And then they wound up around from the tall grasslands into the short grasslands just to the north. And then after all this was over, and I was fearing for my life, they just mostly start grazing. And which is what I was trying to do, because I was trying to see, because part of the study is looking at how much time they spend grazing and which kinds of grasses they prefer, which you can tell generally from a distance. So I just sat there and watched them for the next hour as they were all munching away, except for the matriarch. And she stood there the entire time and stared at me. So this is, I guess you could say, pretty advanced behavior when you think about the goal of protecting them, and then the importance of having an old senior animal. And she was willing to do that. It's really fascinating too, because elephants do this too. And of course, I know this from living in reserves that have domestic elephants in them. And most of those are females. The ones that are used for riding are mostly females. And in Nepal, they're using quite a few of their males for breeding, and they don't keep as many males because they're much harder to control. So what will happen is, even in the elephants' stables, when they're chained up at night, the reserve I was in had anywhere from 6 to up to 12 elephants, depending on which ones they were moving back and forth. One elephant stays awake all night, every night, and they take turns in an elephant herd. So that's amazing when you think about that. How do they decide who's going to stay up tonight? How do they do that? Why do they do it? It's obvious they do it because of protection, because they could be, elephants can in fact be attacked by tigers. It's pretty rare, but it can happen. But that's the kind of sentinel behavior that you get. And it's, once again, consistent with moral metrics. If we're looking at well-being, this is what they engage in to enhance the well-being of their social grouping. But yeah, but Glima, you point that out. I knew my life wasn't in danger with the buffalo, because I knew what they were trying to do. There was another time on that same several-mile path, the middle of the day, walking through tall grasses. The tall grasses are taller than me, 7 or 8 feet tall. I don't even know how I heard it, but there was a cobra in the middle of the path. And I was only 2 steps away when I realized there was a cobra in the middle of the path. That was a lot scarier, because you do not expect cobras to be out in the middle of the day in the wildlife reserve. They're almost completely nocturnal. And so, yeah, that was worse. And they're not social. Any more questions?
Well, it's going to go back to humans.
Mm-hmm.
I've seen this in more than one person, but people will say, oh, I don't want to be a burden onto people when I'm older, and I don't want to be incontinent and bedridden, I just want to die, or I'll stick my head in the oven. But the older they get, the more tenacious they are to hold on to life.
Yeah.
I don't know if you've come across that, but like my mother was losing her mental capabilities, but I was wheeling her in a wheelchair along the sidewalk, and I got a little bit close to where the curb was, and she's, what are you trying to do? Watch out. I mean, her reactions were just like that.
Well, the will to live is very, very strong. And the opposite was probably never a problem in our evolutionary history. We never lived that long, I mean, if you were a Pleistocene herdsman, you could not, a wheelchair wouldn't, even if you were nearsighted, you probably would have gotten run over by a mastodon or something like that. So the will to live is always with us. And when I was talking about these things, and what people, in palliative care and also the ethics side of it has said, is that you have to have these kinds of conversations with people when they still have all their faculties. And, once they get so old, they lose the ability to consent to, euthanasia or something like that. These are the kinds of problems that we're going to have, though. And as I said before, my mother wanted to die, and she would even talk about it openly that she wanted to die for the last three years of her life. So I don't think that's, a universal thing. Certainly in my experience, it hasn't been. I remember when I came from a kind of blended family, and it was my step-grandfather, because my father died when I was young, and my mother got remarried to a guy his wife died when his kids were young. And he was 89 years old. He was not very active late in his life, but I remember the last time I saw him, it was only a few months before he died. And I said, "How do you feel, Gramps?" And he just basically said, "I'm ready to go." So I don't think that's universal at all. He basically said, literally, he said, "I feel like shit." And then he said, "I'm ready to go." So.
Yeah, no, I know that some people are like that. And I know someone else who said, when I get to a stage, just give me something. And I said, no, we can't do that. We just can't do that.
But with living wills, you can. And in the states that allow euthanasia, you can. I mean, if you say, don't resuscitate me, or once I get to the stage where I lose my faculties or this or that, you can do that. And you can give that power to your next of kin. But most states don't recognize that. And most countries don't recognize that. So I think in the United States right now, I think it's only Oregon and Washington that actually do. A friend of mine actually killed himself and he was only my age, and this was a long time ago. He would have been about 50 at the time, because he had a high altitude stroke, which is kind of rare, but it happens once in a while. He went up altitude too fast in the Rockies, and he had partial paralysis on his right side, and he just decided, he was an active field biologist, and he just decided, I can't live like that. So he shot himself. And so we see that too. But this is where, like, what the morality of it would say was with a person's consent. So if you're talking about an old person that's going to get weaker and weaker and more feeble, these discussions have to be had before they get to that stage. What should we do?
Joe,
this and such.
I've been a supporter for years of compassion choices, and if the group is not aware of it, I would suggest that they investigate it. And also, I think there are 5 states, or at least 4 states in Washington, D.C., that is Oregon, I think Washington.
Oregon and Washington were the first 2. I didn't know any more had passed it.
I think something like Montana. I don't have my numbers straight, but surprisingly, area.
We can probably look that up quickly. But
yeah, right. But compassionate
to move in that direction is a point.
Compassionate Choices used to have a local chapter, but the attendance grew less and less, and a good friend of mine led it. And we also had someone from Belgium who did a whole, he's a professor somewhere, and he did a whole presentation on how Belgium, how not only is it legal for adults, it's legal for children. And the thing of end of suffering is constantly people think of it as an aging problem. Yeah. But in Compassionate Choices, Brittany Maynard, who really was responsible, I don't know if she went to California. Actually, you can Google that. Her husband is still very active in Compassionate Choices and other organizations. And her name is Brittany Maynard, was terminally ill, and she refused all attempts to, as far as prolong your life, so to speak. And she died at age 39. But if you Google her name and also Compassionate Choices, there's a lot out there. And I would really heartily suggest that if you're interested and if you are of like mind, that you support the organization.
Well, the Hemlock Society too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Then there's another moral dilemma, and I've seen this with people getting old, that they sleep a lot. They might sleep like 23 hours or more, and they don't want to eat, but people kind of make them eat, and or they wake them up to eat. And I think, why don't you just let them sleep, and if they wake up they're hungry, you feed them. But they haven't wanted to do that because of the legal situation.
Yeah. Well, the problem is, you know, we institutionalize these people. They have to keep on certain schedules for their staff. There's, you know, this and that. And then there's legal liability. If something goes wrong, their relatives have, you know, the power to sue and things like that.
No,
So,
but these are home. These are being taken care of at home.
oh, okay. Well, you know, then people need to, I mean, really, I think it all gets down to having these conversations when a person is, you know, about what they want to do for end of life, and also probably for the kind of thing you're talking about, having some experts out there just train people. If you're taking care of an old person at home and they don't want to eat, don't make them eat, you know. I mean, that should be pretty obvious.
Yeah,
in my mother's case, though, she was wasting away herself. She was refusing almost all food. So they were giving her things like these kind of liquid nourishment things. And I think that's all she was taking for the last about year and a half of her life. She was just wouldn't eat, you know. So, yeah.
I think Duncan has a question.
He's muted.
Oh, let me unmute him.
Might have to unmute himself.
I got it. I wanted to contribute to this dialogue that you have going now. I think the individual's wishes when they are young and able in body and mind, and if you can get them to set that forth in a document, a living will, or what they want and who they want to have to make these decisions when they're not able to make them for the person's self, and that is done. I mean, it can be done. I mean, there's a boilerplate living will,
Yeah.
and but that's general enough that I mean, when the person is appointed as the health or medical care agent, then the person interprets it, and the person should be the next of kin, and the closest of kin, and then I think it should be written down. With
Yeah.
my mother gave me a understanding of this. It's probably about 7 or 8 years. She gave me that agency about 7 or 8 years before it came into being a necessity, and so I learned from her that she did not want to be hooked up in a hospital bed in a comatose situation with a ventilator and artificial alimentation, that she didn't want that, and that she didn't want when she was in a basically close to a comatose state without any of that stuff, she didn't want to be resuscitated by artificial means. And so that was a very important dividing line, demarcation line there that I had to fight for later when I was her agent, because she wasn't in the hospital, she was in home care. But we had, and I took all of the was in home care in her own house. It was a very, very expensive proposition, but she had money, and that was the thing that I had to do for her. It was to give her that, because she liked it in her home. And so we had 2 shifts of people around the clock, 7 days a week. But I told them and made it very clear to them that when it got to that point, the point where we'd already had a couple of trips to the hospital and there wasn't anything that they could do for her, it was low blood pressure or slow heartbeat, that there wasn't anything they could do for her at the hospital. They'd just do some defensive medicine, and then I'd get my mother back then 2 days or 3 days later. And that's not what she wanted. So I told these people, these givers, caregivers, that they were not to call 911, and under what there would be no circumstances other than actual choking to do that. And despite that, there was it was mandated from where she'd had some rehabilitative stuff. There was a physical therapist there that came that decided that the blood pressure was too low and called her a person at the supervisor at the palace. And she had really basically no connection except they were doing this to get Medicare money. Yeah. And called them against my and I had to deal with the ambulance. Ambulance people were sent. I told them to get rid of it, to turn that around, and I had the notice up there that it was her surrogate. I was the one that was making these things, and I had to fight a stand down. I had to stand them down basically in front of the door, saying that, listen, there's no emergency. We've had low blood pressure like this, and it's not. And one of them came up to me and said, well, we can do this either the easy way or the hard way. The easy way is that we come in and we check her out and we decide to take her out, we'll take her out. Or we can do it the hard way, we'll get the police to enforce the same thing. And basically it took all my wiles to keep these people at bay. And finally, he had the lieutenant that was riding on that fire truck with them. And I said, well, she could come and take a look. That's what she suggested as a compromise. And then she wanted to go in and started interviewing my personnel that was there, doing the thing. And basically I told her, listen, you were just going to look at her and see that she wasn't struggling. I'm the one that makes all these decisions otherwise. Here's the document on the wall. And so you are finished here. and basically, wasn't even really able to get her out of the house. I mean, she thought that was her authorities, was basically questioned there. And but I got her out of the house, and I mean, so that's the sort of thing. Even when you do have documents in place.
Yeah, I've heard of that. Yeah.
Well, my understanding is this is still a relatively new era of the law, and it was really, as a president, it was really only Obama that started talking about these sorts of things to the country. Most people still don't have living wills. In the case of my mother, she did, and it was no resuscitation. And the nursing home she was in followed her orders, so she went into a coma one Sunday, and she was dead by Monday morning type thing. So it worked in that case. But the other thing that you mentioned, Duncan, I think is really true. We have a private health care system that's profit-driven, and they could get more money, squeeze more money out of Medicare. I mean,
yeah, absolutely.
And so there's all kinds of legal, and I'm certainly, I have no background in law, maybe other people do, but there's all kinds of legal ramifications of this that pile on top of it. It's kind of like marijuana being completely legal in some states and against the law of the federal government. I mean, that makes no sense at all. But,
Well, I had a chance to premeditate that confrontation I had with that person. And that was in the 60 Minutes episode, 20-minute segment about a man that wanted to commit suicide, and his daughter had helped him to do that within his guidelines. I mean, what he told her to do. But then she had some sort of qualms about it then, and this was under hospice as well. And then she had the qualms about that and quit. Called up it was either a doctor or a hospital saying that she'd done this thing. And so then they came in and they came in with the ambulance and resuscitated her and resuscitated the father. And when he woke up, I mean, he was really mad that he hadn't had his his wishes were fulfilled and carried out. And so I thought, I made a judgment there mentally, and that was that was not consequent. She wasn't self-consistent in her carrying this out. She should have not involved anyone until he had lost his heartbeat and hadn't respired. I think that's something that everyone has to do, but they don't, of course, I don't think the general level of education that we have and the general level of self-sufficiency that we have in the country is high enough to do this. We have too many other things now. Everything's official, or it's following the herd, and then these other agencies get into the thing, like the fire rescue, the nurses, doctors, and they. So I think you'd have to talk about this stuff constructively with many people to solve this problem.
But unfortunately, I would have to say this because this is sort of Glima pointed out the name of my book, but religion has a lot to do with it in this country as well. The Catholic Church teaches absolutely a sin. You cannot do this. When Pope John Paul was dying, he was suffering for years, and he'd give these speeches about how wonderful it is to suffer. I mean, really, that's true. And when you look at that case of the Terry Schiavo case, you all remember that. It was up in Central Park. Brain dead for years.
The president got involved in that.
The president even got involved. And, and it was all religious people there, talking about how awful her ex-husband was. And that was her wishes. And she had been in a coma for years. It was all based on religion. And what I was thinking was, these people believe in heaven. I mean, they should be glad she's dying. They should throw a party, instead of, no, we got to keep her alive. And then, of course, when they did the autopsy afterwards, they found out that over half of her brain had atrophied away. And one of the senators, who was a doctor, said, I know this and da-da-da. And he never saw her, or met her, or diagnosed anything with her. He didn't, so it's ridiculous. So this is where, in this country, more so than any others, and I think, I gave some of the statistics in my book too. When you look at Norway, for example, 80% of the population is just flat out atheist. When you look at France, something like half the population will say they're Catholic, and then you ask those people if they believe in God, something like 30% of the Catholics say they don't believe in God. So, the standards are quite different when you look here versus basically every other Western country. But religion is part of it, and it's a big part of the thing here, and it's a big part of why these laws are like they are, I think.
Yeah.
No, I agree with you, everything that you said. And, honestly, I think a lot of that has to do with, it's kind of like a fear that is indoctrinated in us since we were like a kid. If you kill yourself, or if any death has to be looked at in a certain perspective. I'm not a religious scholar by no means, but as a kid, I was always taught that suicide is a bad thing. Murder is a bad thing. But as I got older, I came to recognize and realize that it depends on the circumstance for murder.
Were you Catholic too? I'm just curious.
Yes, I was actually raised both Catholic and Christian. I gave up religion since I was 10 years old, but I never told anybody anything in fear of, losing my friends and my family. And my mother is, since the day she died, was a devout Catholic. You can't cross her in any form, fashion, or way in that respect. But growing up, I was always taught to look at death as, when you die, you're gonna go to heaven, and life is but a curse until you get to the pearly gates, and that's when living really starts. But in the whole time that you're here, you got to stick it out for as long as possible. In other words, you got to be here miserable till the very last inch of you is gone. And that never set well with me, even as a child. So I don't know. I was
reading somewhere, I don't know how true this is, but I was reading somewhere that I think it was a pope sometime in the 9th or 10th century that made suicide a mortal sin because of the way they were depicting how great heaven was, and people had such poor lifestyles, especially in Europe back then, very high mortality rates. So the Catholic Church literally wanted to dissuade people from killing themselves. So they started saying it's a mortal sin. And that's when it came about. It wasn't apparently in the original canons from the 4th century, from the Bible produced by Emperor Constantine. And I don't know if that's true or not. I've only read that once, but I thought it was pretty funny to think, okay, they're depicting how the afterlife is so great. People living miserably want to kill themselves, and therefore they didn't want to lose too many of their adherents too early. So we have to make this a mortal sin, or else, there won't be any church. Everybody will kill themselves.
Kind of like eating meat on Friday. One day was you can eat meat on Friday, and the next day you can eat meat on Friday. A lot of Catholics were very upset that they couldn't have their
God
steak.
just told me.
There you go.
Mormons do that too, by the way, even more so.
Now, if you don't mind, could I ask you questions? You brought up the whole thing about morality earlier, and you brought up the whole Moses with the commandment, "Thou shalt not kill." I'm not sure. Have you ever heard of something called the 48 Confessions, or is it the 48 Confessions? The Egyptian 48 Confessions. That basically you were about to say?
I've never heard of that.
The 48 Confessions. It's confessions that you are taught to memorize, kind of like the Quran, almost like. And there's 48 of them, and I've read through them a while back. And what I came to see, and I could be wrong, of course I could be wrong, but if Moses was a real person and he had the privilege to live in opulence as he did as a prince, he was exposed to a lot of these texts. He was exposed to a lot of this knowledge the Egyptians held true. And when he went up into that mountain to write up the first tablets of 10 Commandments, he already knew a lot of "thou shalt not kill," because those are in the 48. They're part of the 48. So you think he was like regurgitating some of the knowledge that he already learned from Egypt?
As far as I know, it's all regurgitated. I haven't looked into that. I will look it up after we talk, because I hadn't heard about that. I hadn't really gone into the New Testament stuff in general, other than what it literally says and how ridiculous it is. But what's really fascinating to me is that Egypt was basically a very avant-garde, advanced society at the time. They had, as far as we know, the first form of written language and all these others. They were light years ahead of these Hebrews who were their enemies. But along those lines, what I did write about quite a bit was things in the New Testament. And it is true that there is no miracle attributed to Jesus that wasn't found in some earlier text from some other society. Even
That's
resurrection and crucifixion. And so there's this great book, and you can still find it. It was first published in 1865. And I have a paperback version of it, so it's still in print. And it's called "The World's 16 Crucified Saviors." And it goes through ancient Babylon, ancient China, ancient India, ancient Persia, Greece, Egypt, Rome, etc., and all these miraculous things that happened that are also in the Bible, supposedly attributed to Jesus. So that argues to me that all of these things, including what you're talking about, are just really the result of what anthropologists call cultural diffusion. All across Eurasia at that time, the ancient Silk Roads go way, way, way back. So they weren't in real close contact, but they were in some contact. So, writing starts in Egypt. And the next thing we know, a few hundred years later, the oldest scripts from Hindustan, the ancient Indus civilization, were just a few hundred years later. And then right around the same time, the oldest scripts from China happened, right around that era, within a few hundred years. Now, people I've heard, religious people say that's impossible because people didn't have planes back then and this and that. But I say, hey, I've had friends that walk the entire Pacific Crest Trail in one summer. So somebody could get from Egypt to Israel to Babylon to Persia to India. And diffusion just means to spread very, very slowly. We also know this happened with domesticated animals and plants. We know their origins, and we know how they spread across that vast area across Eurasia, spreading this way. So a lot of this stuff is explainable from basically borrowing from other cultures that preceded them. And we'll never know where the first story of resurrection started, probably. But it was you in ancient China, Krishna in ancient India, Mithra in ancient Persia, Osiris in Egypt. I mean, it goes on and on.
Yeah.
All preceded Jesus. Yeah. So, I mean, that to me is the best argument that it's all a bunch of myth. And if you tell that to a Christian, oh my God, those are false gods. Those didn't exist. And yet there's written material for all of them. And there still are people that can read that stuff, you know.
Right. It's kind of like when you talk history with certain individuals, and they like to say Christopher Columbus discovered America, for example. Okay,
Yeah.
That's what you understand to know, because that's all you know. But
you'd have to go back to the Clovis people some 13 or 14,000 years ago if you want to say discovery.
Right.
If you want to say European discovery, maybe Leif Erikson, but there were other, you know, waves of humans that got here before that. So, you know.
Right. It's like you don't know nothing till you know it. It's like I saw a special a couple of months ago that they were saying something in regards to the Chinese sailing to the Americas 10,000 years ago, and they were able to find remnants of the stone circular anchors. They were considered to be anchors. Yeah. And now there's this one particular individual. He goes around searching for these Chinese anchors. They look like just like donuts made of stone. And supposedly the Chinese had the advanced technology, enough technology to sail across the ocean and eventually
they were certainly the first. You know, the Egyptians and the Chinese were probably the first more advanced technologies. The Indus civilization was kind of right up with them. And I think Babylon was probably next, something like that. But the problem with artifacts like you're talking about is there's always going to be confusion about good, useful things have been invented. You know, so could Native Americans on the West Coast have independently invented those things? Same thing with agriculture. We know that domestication happens separately and independently because we have domesticated animals and plants from South America, which had nothing to do with what was happening in China, India, Iran, stuff like that. Things like llamas and potatoes, you know, came from South America. So there is this possibility,
that's
because
right,
you know, of our brains, that sometimes useful things just happen to get found independently. But when it comes to the ancient miraculous things that we were talking about before, these things had to travel by cultural diffusion across the Silk Road because we know all kinds of other things did. And so why would not these belief systems? And if you try to prove that your God is bigger and better than another God, well, having them all in one, like not only was my God born to a virgin, well, so was Hercules, by the way.
that's right.
He was also crucified, and he was also resurrected, and there was also a star with him, and there was also followers that followed him, and he was born to a royal lineage, and another royal lineage was trying to persecute him, and you find all of those things. Some gods only had 3 or 4 of those traits, but Jesus had all of them. See, ours is the best. I mean, so
right.
How could you? I don't know how anybody can know anything about this kind of history and really sort of take it seriously. It's kind of beyond me.
What is the name of that author you quoted, the world's 16 crucified saviors?
I'd have to look that up. He has an unusual name, and it was from 1865. But if you just look up the book title, and I just typed it into because one of the books I bought, you know, when I was doing background reading to write my book, and I just typed it into Amazon, and it popped right up.
Okay.
Another interesting one I recommend is Jefferson's Bible. It's great because Thomas Jefferson was a follower of Jesus. He thought that Jesus had a lot of good sayings, but he did not believe the supernatural stuff at all. He was not a Christian at all. He didn't believe in the Trinity. He thought the idea of the crucifixion was ridiculous. So his Bible, which you can still get, is all of the New Testament with all of the supernatural stuff cut out. And he literally, I don't know how long he spent doing this, but he took the scissors to it, cut all this stuff out that he thought was ridiculous, and then compiled the rest. So it's not very big, but it's really kind of fascinating how he thought, you know, how he thought about these sorts of things. So those 2 are probably my favorites. I probably read about 5 or 6 dozen books in anticipation, as well as a bunch of papers and articles, but those 2 are my favorites that really stick out to think, okay, even Jefferson thought this was a bunch of malarkey.
Is there anyone that hasn't spoken who has a question?
Or a comment. Am I full of beans? Is that what Glima, term Glima used?
If anyone is interested, I've got a link to Thomas Jefferson, the religious views of Thomas Jefferson. And the only thing is, it's sort of long. It'd be too hard to copy the chat, but it's available. In fact, if they go to Wikipedia and not just get Thomas Jefferson, but to get the religious views of Thomas Jefferson, and it is quotes from his feelings about the Bible, the Jefferson Bible, and his views on religion. So I just
he was really a deist. I mean, he has quotes like, obviously there's the creation, so there must be a creator. But he didn't believe that this God interacted with us at all or even cared about us. And
exactly.
Benjamin Franklin was supposedly a deist as well as Thomas Paine and some of the others.
Yeah. Interesting stuff.
I just looked up that book for Cliff, and the author is Kersey. That's why I didn't remember it. It's Kersey Graves, Graves. And the World's 16 Crucified Saviors you can get on eBay for $7.68. $7.68 used.
I'm copping that today for sure.
Kersey,
that's definitely going in the library.
I've never heard that name before, Kersey, but of course it was published in 1865 and in English. It's in the original.
Okay, thank you.
So Joel, somebody else had a question. Go ahead, Lucas.
Sorry, I kind of think of it as when you talk about they're relating to the book, the variety of cultures that have that same kind of story, that same kind of mythology. I kind of think of it as, let's say that there's creating a practical example for modern times. There's a TV show concept that starts in the US or another country, and another country sees it, they pick it up and they adapt it to their particular country or culture. So in a sense, that's what could have happened. And there's no way because the communication technology wasn't there, or it was much more difficult or unreliable for one society to adapt a story with those elements, and there wouldn't necessarily be an opportunity for the original society that came up with that story to say, hey, well, you took that from us. Just a thought.
It's fascinating, but it's also fascinating, even going back for speculating on this sorts of things. And, I have met a few archaeologists in my life who do this kind of thing, and also physical anthropologists, but the ones that go back into old societies, because even like, how did humans evolve the capacity to have these beliefs? And it must have to do with our very large cerebrum, because that's the main difference between us and a chimpanzee. Well, as how our feet articulate, that's a major difference too. But it must have to do with our very large cerebrum. And it also must have to do with like that cerebrum being able to contemplate our own mortality. As far as we know, for example, all kinds of animals, of course, will feel fear and they'll feel pain, but we don't know that they can think ahead and contemplate a time when they'll grow weaker and weaker and die, or something, or contemplate what happens at death or what could possibly happen after death. And so it must go way, way back in the human lineage, because we know we've been separated. Well, the estimate now is probably no nearer than 6 million years from the lineage that led to modern chimps compared to the lineage that led to us. It goes way, way back. And then we even go back to Neanderthals, which weren't in our direct lineage, but they're kind of close cousins. And even back in some of the cave paintings that have been found in southern France, for example, it's fascinating. I mean, there's the different animals that were around them, but then different symbolisms that might have spiritual beliefs, and also the way they buried their dead implied that they may have had some sort of views about what happens after death or how to take a person out of this realm into the next or whatever. So it's really fascinating to think about that, but because belief in these sorts of things, other than those of us that have gotten sort of, I guess, educated or jaded out of it, you know, belief in these sorts of things is ubiquitous among humans. And, you know, the fact that the beliefs are so different, and there's monotheism and polytheism and Christianity, which is, to me, polytheism masqueraded as monotheism. And there's every kind of, and there's beliefs like Buddhism that preaches no gods. So there's every kind of, you know, view out there, which kind of indicates that there's no one eternal truth. If there were one, you know, we should all know it somehow. But just the capacity for humans to come up with all these things. And I was reading, this just happened last year, a tribe in somewhere in Brazil has very strict criteria about when modern people can interact with pre-contact tribes because of the possibility of spreading diseases to them, for example, and all kinds of other things. So the pre-contact tribe has to, I guess, indicate somehow or express some interest in meeting, you know, your local anthropologist or whatever. Now, there's one of the newest tribes contacted basically has no religious belief. As far as anybody could tell, they don't have any gods, and they'll say, you know, where did the stars come from? And they'll say things like, well, they were always there, you know. And so, and as far as I know, that's the only case in modern humans. And there's even this huge file called the ethnographic data file or something like that. It only existed at 3 universities in the States, and one of them happened to be Michigan, which is where I went. So I worked with my advisor on some of these cross-cultural comparisons. And what the file had was comparative ethnologies of hundreds of different ethnic groups across the time. And all of them in the file, and that was one of the categories that people would look at to be incorporated in this file, was what were their religious beliefs? Beliefs in afterlife, beliefs in spirits, beliefs in multiple gods, beliefs in single gods, all these sorts of things. And every single society until now, it's kind of curious, you know, how we evolved that trait that seems so ubiquitous. And then the other thing is how do you get this little tribe in the Amazon that seem to not have a trait that all of the human beings have? It's fascinating to think about. And yet they have morality. Imagine that.
Well, there are a few authors that have written books or mentioned this in their books. It seems like man has a innate need for a creator, or to believe in a creator, because it's hard to comprehend how something would be there without being made. So it's sort of intrinsic to human psychology.
Yeah.
And then related to that too is that they hunter-gatherer people, they had to psych out their quarry when they were hunting, and so they would have to understand the spirit of that, and so that those sorts of things, and then having to be able to imagine things just to survive, imagining that these two things you see between the leaves might be eyes of a tiger. So you have this imagination that fills in these spaces between, connects the dots, and that would be a sufficient explanation for positing gods.
That kind of trait, the latter trait, is more common than just humans, and that's the tendency toward errors of commission. That is, lots of species do this. Even my dogs do this. I notice when we're walking, because I walk them a lot of times late at night, and if they see, they'll immediately turn their attention to that and, you know, raise their hackles. So it's a little bit of a fear response, even though it might be just something like the wind. But you know, so that seems to make sense within even more primitive psyches than ours, because if you think you perceive something hiding in that bush that might kill you, and you therefore avoid it, you made an error of commission. That is, there was nothing there, but you took action anyway. Whereas if you make the error of omission, that is, you don't think that there's something there and there is, and you don't avoid it, then you're dead. So those kinds of errors are more likely for humans, dogs, all kinds of other species to make. That is, assume that there's danger there, whether there is or not.
So you think, in response to what Duncan was saying, and correct me if I'm wrong, fear is an aspect of where religion was kind of built on. It's like if you, again, I could be wrong. It's that innate fear of not knowing and always wondering. This God concept came out of.
Wondering and fear. I mean, there's certainly all kinds of fear that makes direct sense, and we see it within all kinds of animals too. You know, when you see a predator or something like this. But I think what you're talking about is a deeper fear with the ability to look into our future. Like I said earlier, just contemplate our own mortality. And it is comforting to think that, you know, I might go to heaven, or I might get reincarnated as, I don't know, a buffalo, or, you know, or, you know, whatever kind of afterlife beliefs different religions have. It's comforting to think that. But, you know, what I think is, well, I think it was Will Rogers who said, I was dead for 1,000,000 years before I was born, and it didn't bother me then. So, you know, and I guess also the thought of dying is scary. Because I don't think there's any, I don't think, you know, I think it was like before I was born, you know, like Will Rogers said. But
well, I like, Joel, I like Woody Allen's quote, and he said, I'm not afraid to die. I just don't want to be there when it happens.
Yeah, right.
I have a technical question for Glima. There's so much good stuff that I would like to revisit in this session. And you said it's going to be recorded, Glima, that you're recording it. If you can tell me, it doesn't have to be right now, because we know each other. Is there a way to go back and I'd like to revisit some of Joel's remarks and etc. Can we do that? You're muted.
Yeah, it's going to be on YouTube, so you can. Reverend Tom goes and edits it and puts it on there. So probably in a week.
Oh, so it eventually will be up there.
Yeah, the last 2 humanist talks were on there as well.
Oh, I thought this was the first. Okay, you're filling me in. Good.
Yeah,
so, I didn't realize it was already in session. And meeting once a month, the third Wednesday, I believe.
Yes.
Is what. Yeah, good. Well, thank you, Joel. And I'm going to have to leave, but and Duncan, please say hello to Gisela and everybody. And thank you again, Joel. It was very.
Thank you for joining. It was nice to talk to you.
Thanks, Ray.
Hopefully, see you next month.
Hopefully, yeah. You know, these Zoom meetings I just don't really like. So I was telling Glima I'm going to start coming, and then right after I said that, we had this quarantine. So I really hope that we can all see each other in person at the UU Church beginning in August.
Hopefully.
I'm hoping.
Hopefully.
I'm crossing my fingers, because these talks are really they're stimulating, and it's also nice to get to know other people. But as I mentioned when I gave my talk at the UU Church, I'm not much for Sunday mornings, so I don't think I'm going to be making many of the actual sermons.
Well, I've been a long